Hello, and welcome to Mondays on Tuesdays podcast, where I talk a bit about Compare Basic before the 5-minute mark, and then about something more interesting. Today's topic will be a bit psychological. Hopefully not super dark. I'm going to talk about the identity. And the way we see the world through an identity and how that explains some of the worst and nastiest behaviors you can imagine. If you've ever thought, I wonder how that person can treat other people that way, the answer that I'm going to propose by the end of this podcast is they're not treating a person that way. They're treating an object that way because they're treating that person like an object. The Compare Basic updates for now are demo runs very well. I fixed a number of performance things in it. And I'm now working on the login system. Login system is a bit of an undersell of what I'm doing. It's a whole passporting session serialization pickling, what I consider a masterpiece. It's a crucial part to what I call the symphony of components. And the way they're working together and the potential power this brings is so exciting. I am on cloud 9, even though fundraising is way behind and it's taken seemingly forever to get to this point. It's a real electric, like sparks flying, things about to take off kind of feeling. And I also this week opened up crowdfunding again. I decided to do this full time about a month and a half ago. And I finally got around to getting all the terms and things up online. If you believe in what I'm doing here at Compare Basic and what Compare Basic could be for the world and would like to contribute financially, shareholders have a number of things they can see ahead of other people, and the voting rights specified in the bylaws, I think, are a fantastic front row seat. Every contribution matters. It starts at $5, and the most common contribution is $50 to a couple hundred. If you'd like more information on that, you can find information at comparebasic.com. Scroll down to the bottom. There's a link in the footer called Funding, and I tell you all about the process. The other thing that happened at Compare Basic that was fantastically interesting is that I realized how close the system is to actually having its own language and its own language runtime. And the reason for this is that the sort of symphony of components now involves a dynamic interpreter, which makes use of the sort of static offset optimizations that I wanted from the table struct object. And they remind me of exactly what I was going for based on what happened around like 2008 to 2010 with the release of the Google Chrome browser, and then all of the innovations in JavaScript runtimes that happened from Squirrelfish, SpiderMonkey, TraceMonkey, Jaegermonkey. These were all derivatives. I believe Squirrelfish was the Apple Safari version, and then all of the various Jaegermonkey things, TraceMonkey, were Mozilla's attempt. And what they were doing is trying to solve the problem that when you have a named thing, going through the whole name is expensive, and they are trying to reduce it to a number with an offset. I have my own system for that kind of a thing. It's working in the web templater now, performing very well. It really opens the door to dynamic language capabilities and potentially as well compiled language capabilities. And anyway, I'm kind of basking in this moment that the Compare Basic system is in good enough shape to be able to do crazy stuff. And as I get the demo and the sort of presentation of the crowdfunding scheme and of the business model together, I I really can't wait to solve stuff and actually make an impact, for users who want to do things. So that's the Compare Basic update. I'm going to talk about psychology, identity, how and why people do good, bad things, and how I define intelligence after the music. All right. Now that the intro's gotten me all pumped, I'm gonna say some pumpy stuff. Um, so what you just heard me with the pumpy stuff is the reaction to how genuinely nervous I am to talk about the subject of identity. And you heard, it was accidental, but I'll use it as an example. You heard that kind of masky, jokey bravado. Something I think I definitely have seen a lot, and a lot of us have seen it a lot. And the reason I'm using that as a segue into identity, because identity is not just how you see yourself, but it's the combination of how you see yourself and how you would like to see yourself. And the way that that maps into how people behave in the world around them is, I think everyone is doing things that they want to further their agenda, and I don't think agenda is a bad thing in this case. I mean, we all wake up in the world with some sort of a mission of what we'd like to accomplish, and we go about it. But what happens when something would actually conflict with someone's picture of themselves? I'm not the kind of person that does that. Doing that would mean that I am bad in certain ways, and so I won't accept that. These are all identity circumstances. And so what I argue is that not only can people not take accountable steps to remedy things that they don't accept that they have done because they don't accept that it's a part of who they are, but they may not be able to actually see what they've done. And so one of the things that I find so absolutely interesting is that at times when people are asked to admit fault of a certain kind and they can't, it's not because they don't know what's happened. It's because their personal identity is like a gigantic puzzle. Some pieces are in place, some pieces are not. And they can't find a way to fit in what that puzzle piece would mean for their identity. And so they can't do it. They fight tooth and nail. And if you consider that someone's identity is actually a foundational part of how they understand themselves and reflectively the world, it kind of makes sense that someone knowing what they can do is not helpful. Knowing how they can move past it while being a considered person is helpful. So consider this. If someone is told, so let's say you have a bunch of people who make screws for a living, right? They cast the metal, they carve out the threads, they notch the top, and they ship them out. This company makes screws. We'll call them the screw company. Now, if an employee of the screw company is told that their job is to make as many screws as possible, and that is why they are employed, if someone says, wait a minute, the screw heads are too screwy. I think we need more consistent screw heads so we can fit the drivers in there. This person has the first person making the screws has two choices. Number one, accept that their identity is to be the best employee they can be for the company, and an increase in quality of the screw heads is equal to the numbers of screws they produce every day. Or they could accept that their identity is to look good on paper when the data tracker, logs out at the end of the day how many they produced, and thereby they are not responsible or have any advantage in pausing what they're doing to improve the top of the screws. So it's likely that employee number two who's saying, hang on, we got to improve the quality, may be somewhat baffled that employee number one says, no, we gotta just make as many as possible. And the reason for this is that the job description in this fictional screwy scenario is one in which the identity of the employee has been so bound to a particular metric, particular sort of measurement data point, that they no longer see the overall picture of the company, and the identity of the second person, which if you haven't figured out by now is usually me, is not bound to the description they were given of the way they're going to be measured. They're looking a little more broadly at the situation. And I would say that this is not an employee conflict. This is an identity conflict. This is a conflict of employee number one thinking, probably accurately, that they will be measured a certain way and wanting to satisfy that. and employee number two thinking that the broader quality is their identity. So that's an example of an identity conflict between coworkers. Now, when you take a scenario like this to enough of an extreme, employee number one, who wants the volume of screws to continue, may see employee number two not as a coworker, but as a threat, as an enemy, as someone who is against them and thereby against the company by trying to cause delays. And if there's no explanation between these two employees, employee number one, if they're unable to say, hey, you know what, I'm taking a broad view, I'm thinking ahead, and employee number one could very rightfully say, very cool, save it for upper management, go talk to them and leave me alone. And I have heard that kind of thing. But the part here that gets really interesting to me, as I mentioned in the intro, when humans are treated like objects, is that if employee number one begins to see employee number two as enough against the metrics that they are going to be judged on, they can begin dehumanizing employee number two and see them as someone who's just in the way, and eventually as someone who's not a someone. But they may see their task of getting the screws out to now include, you know, to use a cheeky metaphor, putting the screws on employee number two. So that's an idea of how identity conflicts can lead to objectifying humans and essentially the dehumanization of other humans in terms of how they are treated. Because in this case, the scenario warrants that dehumanization, and so the dehumanization happens. What I find in this analogy, which is people, look at the world the way they look at themselves. They look at, what can happen based on what they think, not what should happen, but what they believe can happen consistently with how they view the situation, they view themselves in the situation. It ends up looking like people who want to be advantageous in a situation and have a map of intelligence that goes a certain way end up talking a whole lot. I mean, people who feel like they're judged on their smartness and not what they deliver, I they just won't shut up. And I think the reason for this is their identity means that if they don't say anything, they didn't matter. And what I want to talk about just a bit here is the idea that because humans are fundamentally inaccurate mental models, in my opinion, everyone is full of good and bad ideas. And so the smartsy smart person who's always right is, in fact, a myth to me. And what I think actually happens is the people that we consider intelligent, the people that we consider really smart, the people that we consider experts, are the people who the only thing we know about them are their good ideas. The only thing we know about them are the drafts of official specs that they have had published or the books that they have had published. And the reason I say the only thing we know about them is because it means that, to me, intelligence is a lot less about being right all the time and a lot more about knowing the difference between being right and wrong and making sure that as few people as possible know when you're wrong and as few people as possible are impacted by when you're wrong. What I mean by this is I think that the people that I associate with being the most intelligent are very, very good at shutting things down when they're not working. They're very aware of their circumstances. They're very aware of when they had a good idea based on sound emotional standing and when they had a bad idea based on reactionary or bad emotional standing. And what's fascinating to me about this, what I get so excited about, is it means that intelligence is more related to an admission of fallibility and an open-minded and flexible and healthy and sort of, I think the sort of clinical word I would use here is plasticity, which means bendy. In terms of understanding that they have ideas they can let go of. They don't have to double down on something that doesn't feel quite right. And And I think the people that we consider just ridiculously dumb and stupid don't necessarily have a higher proportion of bad ideas than the rest of us, but they double down on them and then they end up getting bigger, then they end up reaching the world, and then everybody can see these massive, massive failures. And so I think that intelligence, or I would say the perception of intelligence and the perception of a lack of intelligence actually has more to do with stubbornness and inflated egos that double down on problems than it has to do with the generation of good and bad ideas. And so my sort of theory of identity, and this I may use sort of the wrong terms and it may not be completely fleshed out, but my theory of identity is that intelligence and flexibility of identity are very intimately related, not because of the generation of good or bad ideas, but because of the ability to release and relinquish bad ideas in favor of good ones. And then what the world will eventually see of you over time is your good contributions versus the sort of brittle holding on attachment, um, whereby the the horrible mistakes that you've made will travel very, very far if you double down on them. That's a pretty I think factual and obvious statement. And to circle this back into the idea of how people do horrible things, oftentimes the doubling down on bad ideas can create a scenario, as I talked about with sort of the screw company, where employee number one thinks that employee number two sort of see the big picture as a screwy idea and is screwing with their job, and they get so defensive they begin objectifying the other person to at times to the point of dehumanization. And I think that doubling down on bad ideas greatly increases the likelihood that someone will begin objectifying and dehumanizing other humans, because if their identity revolves on them defending something that is fundamentally wrong, then the only way to preserve that is to destroy anyone who has a better idea. So as sad as that is, as horrible as it is, it kind of leads to this theory that bad people are broken people. And it doesn't mean they deserve, a pass and a forgiveness or something like that. But it does mean that there are certain circumstances where it is unimaginable to get people to calm down or release or relax. And I think this lens of it's an inflated and brittle identity issue can at times surface communication paths. And one of those communication paths that I have seen and I have learned over the years is to try to sort of surface the what I call the identity roadmap. So employee number two in this case, who wants to improve the quality of the screws, and employee number one who wants to just get the existing screws out there. The question would be to employee number one, do you believe that we will be rewarded if we improve the quality of these screws? And employee number one is going to say no. The question is, okay, is there a way we can talk about this that does not disrupt the way you will be judged? And the answer will obviously be to keep shipping the bad screws. But that kind of communication of getting the identity roadmap either orally or in writing can begin to get to the conversation of, I'm not out to get you here. And if you can surface that in fact was the message, it can be debunked and demythed, and then as screwy as it sounds, employee number one and two could actually get along. That's all I got for today. I'm heads down on the system, and as I think we all know, it is a crazy world, but it just might get better as people begin to understand the identity of how they relate to the world, and hopefully communication and an open discussion about roadmaps can keep us all from dehumanizing each other. I'm your host, Firecrow Silvernight. This is Mondays on Tuesdays podcast, and I will see you next week.